The bulldozer was already idling at the curb when Marcus Whitfield realized someone had filed paperwork to seize his grandfather's garage for unpaid taxes he never knew existed. That single moment, standing in the gravel driveway with an eviction notice trembling in his hand, would change everything he thought he knew about his family, his future, and the rusted old building he'd been ready to abandon. Before we go further, if you believe broken things deserve a second chance, hit that like button, drop a comment below, share this with someone who needs hope today, and subscribe to Wisdom Story House. Now, let's step into Marcus's story. Marcus was 34 years old, recently laid off from a logistics company, and drowning in a divorce he never saw coming. His grandfather Walter had passed 8 months earlier, leaving him only one tangible thing: a sagging metal garage on the edge of Millbrook, Ohio, surrounded by overgrown weeds and faded, "No trespassing" signs that nobody bothered to read anymore. Marcus hadn't even opened the place since the funeral. It smelled of motor oil and dust, memories he wasn't ready to face, and bills he couldn't pay. So when Garrett Holloway, a sharp-suited real estate developer with a smile too polished to trust, knocked on his apartment door offering $11,000 for the property, Marcus almost said yes on the spot. $11,000 wouldn't fix his life, but it would stop the bleeding. It would cover 3 months of rent. It would buy him time. "It's just an old garage," Garrett said, swirling the words like they were nothing. "Land's worth more empty. I'm doing you a favor, taking the burden off your hands." Something in Marcus's gut twisted. Maybe it was the way Garrett's eyes flicked toward the property line instead of meeting his. Maybe it was the memory of his grandfather's calloused hands, the man who spent 40 years restoring cars nobody else wanted, who used to say, "Things people throw away, son, that's where the real treasure hides." Marcus didn't sign that day. He told Garrett he needed time to think, and the developer's smile flickered, just for a second, into something colder. That night, unable to sleep, Marcus drove to the garage for the first time since the funeral. The padlock was rusted shut, and he had to break it with a tire iron his hands remembered better than his mind did. Inside, dust hung thick in the beam of his phone flashlight, and shapes loomed under canvas tarps like sleeping animals. He pulled back the first cover and froze. Underneath was a 1967 Shelby GT 500, its paint dulled but its lines unmistakable, sitting on flat tires like a forgotten king on a crumbling throne. He moved to the next tarp, hands shaking now, and found a Lotus, the kind he'd only seen in magazines his grandfather used to leave on the coffee table. By the fourth car, Marcus was sitting on the cold concrete floor, surrounded by 7 vehicles that, even to his untrained eye, looked like they belonged in a museum, not a falling-down garage on the outskirts of nowhere. Taped to the windshield of the Shelby was an envelope with his name on it, his grandfather's handwriting slanted and shaky from those final years. Marcus opened it with trembling fingers. Inside was a letter that began, "If you're reading this, you finally came back. I'm sorry I never told you what's really here. I was protecting something, and someone, and I didn't know how to explain it without dragging up the past." The letter explained that Walter hadn't just been a mechanic. In his younger years, he'd been the trusted confidant and chief mechanic for a racing driver named Desmond Kane, a man who'd dominated regional circuits in the late 60s before a scandal involving a rival team owner forced him to disappear from the sport entirely, his name erased from records, his cars hidden away to protect them from a lawsuit that would have stripped him of everything. Walter had stored Kane's entire collection in secret, promising his old friend he'd guard it until the time was right to bring it back into the light. Kane had died years ago with no family to claim the cars, but he'd left specific instructions: the collection belonged to whoever proved they understood its true worth wasn't measured in dollars. Marcus read the letter 3 times before the weight of it fully landed. His grandfather hadn't just left him a garage. He'd left him a responsibility, a piece of history that powerful people might still want buried, and very possibly the reason Garrett Holloway was so desperate to get his hands on this land before anyone looked too closely. The next morning, Marcus drove to the county records office instead of calling Garrett back. He spent 6 hours digging through dusty archives, learning that Desmond Kane's scandal had actually been a cover-up engineered by a rival team owner named Holloway Sr., who'd sabotaged Kane's car during a championship race that nearly killed him, then spread rumors that Kane himself had cheated to escape blame. Garrett Holloway wasn't just any developer. He was the grandson, and if those cars surfaced with proof attached, old wounds and old debts might resurface along with them. Marcus felt something shift inside his chest, something between rage and purpose. He thought about his own father, who'd walked out when Marcus was 9, and how Walter had been the only steady hand in his life since. He thought about how easy it would have been to sell the land and let the bulldozers erase the last physical proof that Walter Whitfield had spent decades quietly protecting a wronged man's legacy out of nothing but loyalty and love. He wasn't selling. When Garrett returned 3 days later with a higher offer, $18,000 this time, urgency bleeding through his composed exterior, Marcus met him in the garage doorway and simply stepped aside, letting him see what waited inside. Garrett's face went the color of old paper. He stammered something about needing to call his office, but Marcus already knew the truth was written plainly across his expression. This was never about land value. This was about silencing a story that could still embarrass his family name, a story about a driver his own grandfather had destroyed out of jealousy and greed. What happened over the following weeks surprised everyone, including Marcus himself. Instead of hiding the collection or selling it to the highest bidder out of spite, he reached out to a classic car historian named Priya Anand, who'd written extensively about lost racing legends of the era. Together they verified the cars, authenticated Kane's ownership records, and slowly, carefully, told the real story to a small motorsport magazine willing to listen. The article spread further than anyone expected. Old racing fans who remembered Kane's brilliance behind the wheel began reaching out, sharing photographs, old ticket stubs, memories of a driver who'd vanished too soon and too unfairly. A museum in Indianapolis offered to feature the collection permanently, with full credit given to both Desmond Kane's talent and Walter Whitfield's quiet, decades-long loyalty. Marcus didn't get rich overnight, but he got something he hadn't expected to find when this all began: a sense of who his grandfather truly was, and by extension, a clearer sense of himself. He used part of the museum partnership proceeds to restore the garage itself, transforming it into a small community workshop where local teenagers could learn mechanics, the same way Walter had once taught him. During quiet summer afternoons that Marcus had almost forgotten mattered, he named the program Kane's Legacy, and on opening day, an elderly woman approached him in tears, introducing herself as Desmond Kane's niece, the only living relative anyone had managed to track down. She hadn't known her uncle's cars still existed. She hadn't known anyone still remembered his name with anything other than the false shame his rivals had attached to it. Garrett Holloway never returned to Millbrook after that day in the garage doorway. Word eventually reached Marcus that the Holloway family's real estate ventures in the region quietly stalled, whether from guilt, exposure, or simple bad luck nobody could say for certain. Marcus found he didn't think about Garrett much anymore. He was too busy watching teenagers from broken homes, kids who reminded him achingly of himself at that age, learning to rebuild engines with the same patient hands his grandfather had once used to teach him. If this story moved something in you, if it reminded you that the things we almost throw away sometimes hold the deepest meaning, please take a moment to like this video, leave a comment sharing your thoughts, and share it with someone who might need a little hope today. And before we close this chapter, if you've made it this far and you believe kindness and patience can still uncover buried treasure in this world, type the word legacy in the comments below. I'd love to see how many of you carry that same belief. Marcus kept his grandfather's letter framed above the garage workbench, where every new student could read it on their first day. Underneath it, he added a single line of his own: some inheritances aren't measured in money, but in the courage to finally open the door.